All right, so we have been going through the Gospel of Luke and particularly paying attention to how Jesus was on God's mission along the way. And of course, his mission that the Father had put him on is going to take him to a very difficult place. Now, in a moment, I'd like to get a volunteer to read just a couple of verses from Luke 18, the first couple of verses, starting with verse 31. So somebody nearby who hasn't had it, we've almost had everybody get involved in the service this morning. Lewis, you have not been involved in the service, so you will stand up. And I think you can read it right where you are in a moment. So you'll read verses through 31 through 34 in a minute. But first, just what's gone before. In the chapters since we gathered a couple weeks ago, there's been several parables. There was chapter 15 of Luke's Gospel, which describes the Father's quest. And Jesus is on earth because he's living out the Father's quest. The parables I'm thinking of are familiar. Parable about a lost coin. Parable about a lost sheep. And then two lost sons. A younger lost son and an older lost son. And you know those, Luke 15 is just the parables of the lost ones. And they all have the same basic trajectory. Something that's very precious to somebody has been lost. And there is a quest to find it. And then when it or him has been found, there's a party. And of course, Luke 15 ends with the Father welcoming the prodigal home and throwing a huge party for the son who had insulted him. And there's this huge party. That's how the Father's quest ends. And then in chapters 16 through the first half of the chapter we're in, chapter 18, so 2.5 chapters, there's a bunch of parables and few encounters. And I just want to name some of them that you might remember. Parables of the shrewd manager, the rich man in Hades, the persistent widow, the Pharisee and the tax collector. Then the encounters, Jesus encountering 10 lepers, healing them, one saying thank you, the little children that come to Jesus, and the rich young ruler, which is right before this story. And for all these encounters and all these parables that take place after chapter 15, the issue is the Father is on a quest to find that which has been lost from him or even taken from him. Who will be in the party that the Father's going to put when he finds that which can be found? Because, of course, when it comes to human beings, it's not an object like a coin, like a lost coin. There is a human response, and today we're talking about faith. Because, of course, the way that lost son's parable ends, it's not just the parable of the prodigal son. The father has two lost sons. Ironically, it's the prodigal who's with his father. It is the older son, the moral son, the Boy Scout son, the never let the father down son, who is outside the party, and the story ends with it not being clear, is he even going to come in or not? And so the father's on a quest, and the issue is who's going to celebrate. Now, of course, the father's quest of finding that which has been lost, that's which has been taken, is the son's mission. But the son's not just talking about it. The son's not just telling parables. The son's not just healing people, which is an important part of what we're going to talk about today. The son is also preparing to die, because the father's quest is going to require the son's sacrifice. The son's sacrifice. And of course, the son's sacrifice is going to lead to the events we talk about in Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday. So Jesus knows this is coming, and he makes a prediction right in the middle of a series of parables in his ministry. So, Lewis, if you now would read verses 31 to 34. Would you stand up so people can hear you in the back and all?
Jesus took the 12 aside and told them, "We're going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be delivered over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, insult him, and spit on him. They will flog him and kill him. On the third day, he will rise again. Disciples did not understand any of this. Its meaning was hidden from them, and they did not know what he was talking about.
So as the embedded embodiment of the Father's quest, Jesus was on a mission, and he embraced it. And John read, of course, Isaiah's prophecy. This was prophesied hundreds of years before, that there would be one who is kind of, the summary person is a suffering servant who would go through tremendous pain and rejection, and then somehow there's healing for other people. Very mysterious prediction that Isaiah made hundreds of years. One of the ways we can know that Jesus' death on the cross was not some accident, it was predicted in the Jewish scriptures, and Jesus was the fulfillment of those scriptures. Now, most Jews thought, okay, in what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, there's this person, the suffering servant. Isaiah 53, several different chapters of Isaiah. There's 3 different sections where it talks about him. They also, of course, knew about this person called the Messiah. Many scriptures about Messiah. And most Jews, including the rabbis and the priests and all this, they just assumed those are 2 different guys. Because they thought, we all know Messiah will defeat evil. And you do that through power, like King David coming again. You know, he'll be like David, a warrior. And his suffering servant, that's really interesting. But, you know, that's somebody else. And so when we read, as Lewis just did for us, about the way the disciples were confused, I'm going to read it, just that one part again. The disciples did not understand any of this. Its meaning was hidden from them. They did not know what he was talking about. It's because they just made the decision, Jesus is Messiah. So he's going to march in and speak the words, and the angels will come down and destroy our enemies, and in fact, the beginning of a world revolution of righteousness. And Jesus is saying, we're going to go into Jerusalem so that I can be mocked, insulted, spit on, flogged, and killed. They just couldn't imagine that the Messiah would be the suffering servant. And in their confusion, the disciples become barriers to the Father's quest. And this happened several times. They became barriers. So I'm going to read the next verses. Verse 35. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening. They told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. He called out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Now, that's really strange to hear that the disciples rebuked the guy just for asking for help. The disciples had seen Jesus heal many people, right? The healings had happened a lot already. They knew Jesus enjoyed healing people. And so the question is, why did they stop him? And they even said, hush, hush, do not, do this. And what I conclude is that it's because they were still confused. And they were sort of mad about it. I mean, Jesus tells them, we're going to Jerusalem so you can watch me get crucified. And then the next thing that happens is this blind man says, help, help, please help me. Calls out, and they were like, we can't deal with this. See, because they're overwhelmed by the fact that Jesus is saying he's going to suffer. And it just seems to me it's a good point for us to acknowledge that when disciples become confused about Jesus, they tend to become graceless, not gracious. To be gracious, we need to be clear about who Jesus is. In fact, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I just make the analogy today that all the confusion about who Jesus is a lot about why there's not enough graciousness in the church and the church for the world. In theological communities that mainline theological communities sometimes that, theologically are sometimes called the liberal theologians. There's confusion about whether or not Jesus actually atoned for sins on the cross, whether he was actually raised from the dead. Some of the people we read, some of the people that we talk to have questions about whether or not Jesus is just a good teacher. If you're confused about that, you're going to kind of hold back on telling people the good news about Jesus, wouldn't you? And guess what? That's why there's been such a loss of vitality in many of those traditions. But there's something even worse happening now. There's confusion among people who really had good understanding about who Jesus is theologically. Yes, not only a teacher, the one who dies on the cross, who suffers, who atones for our sin, who is raised in power, the living Lord, and in his name there is power. That community which never lost an understanding has yet sometimes seems to turn the whole faith of Jesus Christ into a political ideology. More of a Phariseeism, if they're not mindful of the possibility. So again, whether it is the liberal theological deviation that makes people graceless because they don't share Jesus, or it becoming for them rather something that is mainly about being against other people rather than the way Jesus was for people, then either one of those, that lack of clarity makes people graceless instead of gracious. So, I mean, we all, whatever our propensity, we all have to be careful not to let be confused. And that's why we go back and we look at the Scriptures to find out who Jesus is. The unique figure of human history, the unique person of human history who offers people life, forgiveness for their sins because he died on a cross. And he brings a kingdom of love, joy, and peace to earth for all kinds of people. So whatever we're struggling with, we don't get confused about Jesus. We're clear about Jesus so that we can be used by Jesus. Now, we may be struggling with lack of clarity sometimes. I'm not, when I say we, I'm not talking about us, of course. I'm talking about all the other people who are Christians in the world. We're all clear, right? Yeah, that we is like everybody, all those other people in the world. No, I mean, you know, but if there are times we're not clear about Jesus, one thing is clear, there are people who are clear about their need for healing from brokenness. We're going to encounter them all the time, just as the disciples who were going with Jesus encountered these broken people, even if they were like, I don't understand this stuff, what he's asking of us. I'm confused. What I thought the kingdom of God was going to be like is not exactly what Jesus seems to be talking about. And we see that with this blind man on the side of the road. When he heard that Jesus was passing by, he was not confused. He was not shy. It says he called out, "Have mercy on me." Then starting with verse 39, those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet. That's where their confusion, like, no, your needs are not what we're about. But he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, Jesus asked him, What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord, I want to see," he replied. Jesus said to him, "Receive your sight. Your faith has healed you." Your faith has healed you. Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. When all the people saw it, they also praised God. Why do you think that Jesus said to the man who's blind, who's got an obvious problem, "What do you want me to do for you?" Maybe somebody hasn't spoken yet today. Because it's kind of, why did he say that? What do you want me to do for you? What's that?
He was clear on who Jesus was.
Yes, but why did Jesus say to the man, "What do you want me to do for you?" I guess anybody.
Wanted to specifically hear his faith in action, like, tell me what it is that you want. I mean, although Christ knows what he was.
Jesus wanted to hear him say it.
Yes.
Jesus knew, before the man was born, the sovereignty of God. Jesus could know this man was going to be blind, this man was going to need this. Jesus knows. But he wants him to say it. He wants to hear him say it. Now you can find healing things where Jesus doesn't do this. I'm not saying this is a requirement, but it's more typical. One time there's 4 guys who bring a man to Jesus when he's just paralyzed. But there's usually an aspect of human faith. There's the faith of people around you who bring you to Jesus, and there's the faith of the person who Jesus says, "What do you want? What do you want?" Man says, "I want to see." Other places, "I want to get well." And Jesus then acts upon it. Some of you remember the passage we used. This is so familiar, but we used it about a year ago. We all kind of memorized it. Ephesians 2:8. For by grace, Paul's writing, he's summarizing the gospel. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And then the next verse talks about 4 works. So I've put it back up here again. This is the gospel in an absolute nutshell. God does the saving. God does the healing. And he does it through his sheer grace, not because we deserve it. But there's an aspect of our faith. Faith is not in charge. You don't get healed because you believe it. Positive thinking is a very dangerous ideology to think that it's all about positive. I mean, of course, you'll hear me talk about positive thinking in a moment. But the idea that we heal ourselves through positive thinking is not the message of the Christian faith. We are healed because God, who has a heart to save, is gracious. But then there's a role of human faith. It's not the locomotive. It's further along in the train. And then, of course, all of this produces good works. And we never want to say you put good works first. You know, that our works, we save ourselves through our works or stuff like that. This is the proper sequence that Paul reminds us to have. And so, what is the role of faith? What is the role of faith? I've offered this many times. You know, it's just one of the best knowledge I can give. Faith, of course, is thinking and believing. But when you see all the times that Jesus used children as an illustration, the best image for faith is a child who really can't make it in the world without the parent. And the mother or the father, both, if both are involved, want to do good things for the child. And the child cannot make those good things happen, but the child has to have a posture of daddy or mommy to receive that which the parent wants to give. That is faith, open-handedness and receptivity. Instead of children often growing up to be teenagers, if you haven't noticed, and they usually look like this. And that's not the posture of receptive faith. You know, what do you want from me now? Many of them do open their hands and hearts up to us, you know, the teenagers and young adults. But the posture of faith is best demonstrated by a child. So here, before we go, I just wanted to show a list of what I call, you know, the aspects, ingredients, steps of saving faith. Now, I say healing faith, saving faith, because, of course, what Jesus did on earth to heal, he sometimes still does miraculously now. More often, he's using the Father's natural healing process and accentuating that. But when we talk about healing faith, it's also the ultimate healing is the moment that we are absolutely lifeless, dead, returning to dust, and he resurrects us to be more ourselves than ever out of stuff that will never die. That's the healing that is most powerful. So what are the aspects of that? The first is that we trust in Jesus. Each of these could be a sermon, of course. I'm just bulleting them. My point is, we trust in Jesus, not ourselves. There is a place to have faith in yourself. I believe the more you put your trust in Jesus, the more you will believe in yourself. But the reality is that we are sinners who fall short of the glory of God. We've got limitations, and that we can't will ourselves into moral perfection. We can't will ourselves into overcoming the trauma that may have been done to us in our childhood. We cannot will ourselves that receiving what Jesus gives, That's the faith. Jesus would say to people, look at me. Look at me. And that's most powerful. Many of our friends believe in positive thinking and self-help. That's great. But we want to help them put your faith in Jesus. And that's part of our mission. The second one is to open your hands to God. I've already talked about this with the child. Have a posture of receptivity. Don't be a teenager before Jesus with closed arms. All right? Third, name your brokenness. Name your brokenness. The blind man really couldn't deny that he was blind, but there's so many other forms of needed healing where people won't even name it. They won't admit it. To name it before God, and often means naming it to people who God has given you to help you make the journey of life, to name it and ask them to pray for you. And that there's a power in saying to people, I'm struggling with this thing. And you trust them with that, and they pray for you, and God honors that. And some of the power you don't have in your lives, you would have if you had trusted people who you could name the things with. And then, finally, taking courageous action. The courageous action of the blind man, calling out, heal me, being like a fool out of himself. Many times Jesus said, stand up and walk. People had to do something. They had to have faith that was courageous. And that's a huge part of this. So when I talk about healing, I mean the whole thing. I mean healing from accidents, from diseases, from addictions, from lifestyle compulsions, healing in marriages, healing in all other kinds of relationships, healing from grief or loss, all the different forms of that. So I want to ask you before we wrap up, what are some of the ways, and different ways of, because there are all these different things I've talked about of healing, that people can be courageous, that fourth step of acting upon it, not just coming to a worship service. I believe in Jesus, I'm praying for healing. I've even told other people, and I'm trying to have a receptivity posture. I even raise my hands in worship. But what are some of those action steps that require courage that are just important if we're going to be honest, if he says to us, what do you want? We have to say, I want to be healed. What are some of the action steps for various ways?
Confession.
Naming it, particularly if it's been a relationship problem, confessing that to them.
Recognizing your own weakness to ask for it, to own your own weakness.
Yes, to be able to name the brokenness and own it. What are some action steps?
Go to Scripture and listen to what God says.
Feed upon the Word. That's an action step. Yep.
Get an accountability partner or group where you confess and then you ask them to keep you honest and not just...
And you talk about it. I said I was going to do these things, and a week or two later, I'm accountable. That's why 12-step groups are so powerful, is the accountability.
Forgiving yourself, and I think you have to come to a point
Mm-hmm.
where I'm not okay, I haven't been okay, but you're the only way to
Mm-hmm.
so
Yep, forgiveness. You all are taking that to Santiago's. You're on this diet, cleansing. You're taking action. You're working hard at that. All the things you had to do to this, and that's an action step. Taking your medicine is an action step. Acting upon a diet, saying I refuse to live in the situation I'm in. And I could be like a secular person, say, it's all about me, I got to overcome. Or you can say, I'm going to trust in Jesus, open my hands to God, name my brokenness, and while I take those action steps. Going to counseling is a huge action step. I think many people need counseling for grief losses. I know that the most important thing I had when I had such grief a couple of years ago was to go to counseling. Even though I could point to other people who need to go to counseling more than me. I went to counseling to deal with my grief, to deal with what I could learn. And that's an important thing, to take action steps and to say, I want to get well. I wrote some other, we covered most of them. Going back to school, going out and looking for a job, working out at the club, at the health club. There's so many different types of action steps. Now, we know that many of the times the things that we need healing from don't get fixed in this life. There are relationship issues that I don't know that will ever get fixed in my life. As much, even if I'm totally faithful to Jesus Christ. There's things I can't control. There are people that I've prayed for healing who there's the limits. There's people we've prayed for not to die of cancer that have died. I also know that I thought sometime thinking about the many ones, and of the people you all know, Anthony Saracel hit by that car in Bean. Those of you who know that when he was hit by that car, and virtually brain dead, and actually Jim Cobb, who the Cobbs aren't here today, but he had 3 brain surgeries, and he's still age 72 and practicing medicine after having brain surgery. He's opened up 3 times, and a just credible kind of story. We give glory to God for medicine and for medical advances, but we also know that we are obedient to Him when we pray and say, Lord, it's in your hands, but heal me. Because ultimately, of course, the healing that's going to happen is resurrection. So let me invite the band to come on up and just and share with you that whatever way you would like to be healed, it's a privilege for any of us to be in a situation to anoint you with oil and to pray for healing. Jeanette Gibbons and I have often been in a situation, as she been an elder, and I worked with her. She and Hank and I prayed for people, laid hands on people and prayed for them. I know we've done that in our services. We do believe in miraculous healing in the name of Jesus, but the reality is that so much of the healing that people need is not medical, it's relational, and it's spiritual, and it's emotional. Let's be the people of God who help others encounter the risen Christ. Let's not be disciples who get in the way because we're confused about who Jesus is. Let's have that just love and devotion and trust that Jesus will use us in His ministry to heal others while He's healing us.